Good afternoon, and welcome to this introductory video on playing hymns on the organ. The level of ability or background that I would expect you would need in order to take full advantage of this discussion is that you would have had approximately 4 to 6 months of organ study, perhaps a semester in a college or privately, and the first few chapters of an organ method book, or in your private lessons you would have covered such manual and pedal skills as attack and release, substitution, and glissando, and the like. For purposes of our discussion today, let's use the hymn tune Dix. It's definitely a romantic hymn, and it also is very good for our traditional approach to teaching hymn playing on the organ that we'll be using today. The first thing I suggest that you do is that you read the text of the hymn aloud. Look for places where you might breathe, look for the style of the poetry itself, and think in terms of keeping a very good reading pace. For the beauty of the earth, for the beauty of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Now let's look at the hymn from the perspective of an organist. When the example comes up on your screen in a moment, you will notice that it is in 4-part harmony. And this is not piano music and it's not organ music. It's actually 4-part vocal music. So first we must deal with that. Then, if you're a pianist, you also notice at the organ that, of course, you don't have, for purposes of playing legato, you do not have a damper pedal. Instead, you have a pedal division, and you need to deal with that. Thus, you should become an editor. And my suggestion is that you make a study copy of this hymn in order to mark it up according to the principles that we will be discussing shortly. Looking at the first line of the hymn, you'll note that in the treble clef there are 2 parts, and these are the soprano and alto, which you play with your right hand. The left hand plays only the tenor line, and the bass line is played at the pitch notated in the pedals. This is according to the traditional hymn playing instruction that I noted we would be using today. Thinking back to your first lessons, you know that you were taught that repeated notes need to be carefully treated as a note value and a rest value, and we'll follow that skill along. Thus, if you have repeated quarter notes, as you do in the alto part in the first 2 upbeats, those 2 quarters become an 8th note and an 8th rest. And you can follow this policy throughout in marking up the repeated notes. Also, for achieving a better legato, the use of ties may be indicated in hymn playing. We never extend ties across the bar line. Certainly we don't use them at all in the melodic line, but in the inner parts or the lower part, we do not extend them across the bar line because it obscures the strong downbeat necessary for communicating the rhythm and the pace of the hymn to the congregation. I will show you going past the alto repeated note D's in the first couple of bars. Here's what I mean. As you see, it was impossible to tell where the downbeat was located in that demonstration. Also note that slurs in hymns, if there are any, and there aren't any in this hymn, but they are there to indicate that one syllable is sung to 2 or more notes. Alto part is the most convenient for tying, possibly also the bass part, or in this case the pedal part. Rapid chord changes in this hymn means it is possible to play successfully without ties, but the performance can certainly be enhanced with your legato by a few judiciously chosen ties as indicated here. You have a couple of ties, for example, that you can use in the pedal in measure 2, beats 3 and 4 on the C, and the substitution, by the way, can be made on the quarter note if you wish. And then in measure 3, the D's on beats 3 and 4 as well. Fingering. Minimizing substitution for simplicity's sake. Just note that your substitution needs to be made rhythmically on the second eighth of the quarter note. I'll demonstrate slowly in the first 2 upbeats. Work rhythmically always in developing these skills. Also note that in the first full measure, for small hands, the alto C may be taken with the left hand, and I've marked that with a little blurb to show you that it goes down to the left-hand part. Phrasing and breathing. 2 places in this line that you might breathe, your congregation may want to breathe. First is a half note in measure 2, which becomes a dotted quarter plus an eighth rest in all parts. And the half note at the end of the line becomes a quarter plus a quarter rest. 2 cautions from David Heller in his wonderful manual on hymn playing. Number 1, don't clip the ends of your phrases. You can avoid that by pressing into the keys as you release them for the breathing rest. And number 2, following the rest, be careful not to rush the downbeat of the next phrase. I would also add that after the rest, watch that your attack is clean on the first chord of the following line. Now let's talk about the pedal line. You will be familiar with the toe and heel marks. Here, the right foot is marked above the staff and the left foot below the staff. On the first note, I suggest that you play it with the toe for rhythmic control, not the heel, which is a bit awkward. Play the note with the toe, and on the second eighth note, roll to the heel. This is known as same foot substitution, as you may recall. Begin each line of this hymn with this technique. There is also one other same foot substitution suggested in measure 2 of this line. Here you may substitute on the second quarter if you like. Note that you could tie the C's in measure 2 and the D's in measure 3, as I mentioned. Now, let's listen to the first line of the hymn as edited. Line 3 of the hymn, the refrain, uses similar marks as line 1. There are 2 differences. Number 1, at the end, at the half note in measure 2 of the line, place a slur and carry over without a breath in the right hand. The left hand has a repeated note G half note, which becomes a dotted quarter and eighth rest. I might also note that in line 2, which we have not discussed, in verse 1, the half note in midline is carried over also because there's no comma there, and this can be done with the same fingering as line 1, as a half note without the eighth rest. The second difference in line 3 is in the 2 upbeats at the beginning of line 3. There's a collision between the alto and tenor lines on beat 4. Mark out the tenor D, and you might even put an eighth rest there. Play the alto D as an eighth note eighth rest, as at the beginning of the hymn. And play the second eighth note C in the tenor with the left hand as usual. In the last 2 measures of this line, it is convenient for small hands to take the alto C's and the last note B with the left hand. Before we listen to these line 3 as marked, let's consider hymn registration. In the manuals, build up a tower of principal tone using 8-foot, 4-foot, and 2-foot principal tone, avoiding too many 8-foot stops, which makes a muddy sound. One might also couple bright stops from a secondary manual if needed. In the pedal, use clear, prompt speaking 16 and 8-foot principals with possibly the great to pedal coupler. Now let's consider the time between verses. When leading congregational singing of this hymn tune, Dix. It may be necessary to give your congregation more time than the half notes given as the last chord. With a choir helping to lead the singing, it might be possible to go on to the next verse with only a slight tenuto, but here it is suggested that you make the closing chord a dotted half note followed by a quarter rest. This change essentially maintains the integrity of the meter. I noted also that in interpreting the text of verse 2, you may want to slightly reduce the sound for verse 2. We listen now to line 3 of Dix. It may be more practical, certainly as in this hymn example, to use a larger note value than the pervasive quarter notes that you find throughout here. Say the half note unit. This is of course better and more convenient for processionals, for example, and it gives a better flow. I can give you a rough idea. Now let's listen to the entire first verse of the hymn based on the editorial decisions that we have just made. Now the real work of learning this hymn begins. I'd like to offer a few tips for success. It can be quite difficult to assimilate all of these skills at once. Therefore, you should break them down, break the parts down, and practice slowly, rhythmically, and accurately. First the pedal line, then the left hand, and then put the left hand and pedal together. This, I suggest you do double duty on this segment because the left hand sometimes likes to do what the pedal is doing. Next, practice the right hand, then the right hand and pedal, and then your two hands together without the pedal. Finally, very slowly and carefully, put all of the parts together. Continuing to develop this process until your muscle memory for all of this becomes secure. The payoff, of course, is in much increased confidence in your leadership of congregational song. Good luck to you as you practice, and thank you for watching. Until next time.